Before I begin, I want to explain my history with the Metroid series to prove that my views have merit. While I wouldn't call myself a fan of the series, I do have knowledge of and experience with Metroid. I first learned of the series through Smash Bros. Melee, at a time when all I knew about Nintendo was Mario. And then when the Wii and Virtual Console came out, I dabbled in many of Nintendo's other franchises, Metroid among them. I tried out both the original NES Metroid and Super Metroid, and then a few years later, I bought a used copy of the original Metroid Prime. I still have that copy with me almost 20 years later, price tag included. Look at that, $4. What a steal. I sampled Metroid Prime 3 with a friend at one point, but that's the extent of my hands-on experience with the series. But I was also educated on a lot of the behind-the-scenes happenings. I was aware back in the late 2000s that Retro Studios had lost 3 key staff members just recently, and I was aware of the existence of Metroid Dread ever since then. When the game's reveal trailer back in 2021 showed the Metroid 5 text, my immediate thought was, this could be Metroid Dread. I've also dabbled in other Metroidvanias, including many of the post-Symphony of the Night Castlevania games, as well as 2 more recent titles, Ender Lilies Quietus of the Nights and Chasm. All of this is to say that my views expressed henceforth are strictly based in pragmatic, educated realism. I respect the Metroid series for what it is, and the genre as a whole, but I'm not so blinded by odd reverence toward them to be afraid to speak harsh truths. And I replayed both Super Metroid and Metroid Prime in preparation for this video as well. I'll go more into that later, so please don't be mad at me. Before anything else, I'm going to go over the series' history and focus specifically on the game's sales figures and the wider context in which they exist. Alongside Metroid, I'm going to do the same with The Legend of Zelda and compare and contrast them. Both the original Zelda and Metroid games came out in 1986, a very special time in gaming history. Gaming as we know it today largely took shape during this time, the 3rd generation of consoles. Standards during this time were practically non-existent, leaving plenty of room for experimentation. Both the original NES Zelda and Metroid games added an element of non-linearity, contrasting with Super Mario Bros. And most other games at the time. The original NES Zelda sold about 6.5 million units, while Metroid sold a little under 3 million. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link sold about 4.3 million units, while Metroid 2: Return of Samus sold about 1.7 million. And this is the general range where sales figures for both series would settle with few caveats for the next 3 decades. Mainline Zelda titles would typically sell between 3 and 5 million, while Metroid titles would typically sell between 1 and 2 million, excluding the remakes. The only exceptions being Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess for Zelda, which sold between 7 and 9 million, and the original Metroid Prime, which sold 2.8 million. The sales dips for both Zelda 2 and Metroid 2 indicate how many people who played the originals were hooked enough to stick with the series. The brief spikes in sales these series occasionally enjoyed can at least be partially attributed to additional complementary factors. Ocarina of Time and Metroid Prime were both the first 3D incarnations of their respective series, so standards were once again low, giving both series a chance to draw in new fans. And Twilight Princess was a launch title for the Wii, which certainly added a not insignificant number to its sales total. But things took a drastic turn during the Switch generation. Breath of the Wild completely reinvented the Zelda formula, and Tears of the Kingdom further developed this new formula, and both games have sold a combined total of over 50 million units. Metroid Dread stuck to the traditional Metroid formula, but is only barely the best-selling Metroid game, with a little over 3 million units sold. People tend to see Zelda as Metroid's more successful older sibling, but really, that's only kinda sorta true. The average sales for Zelda was only a couple million more than Metroid for most of their existence. Zelda had a more consistent release schedule, sure, but sales weren't much better. But that's all changed with the breakout success of the Breath of the Wild formula. I'm writing this script before sales data of Metroid Prime 4 has come out, so whatever sales boosting the quote-unquote open world editions that game employs might bring won't be considered in this video. But it's abundantly clear that Zelda managed to find gargantuan success specifically because of the changes it made, while Metroid failed by sticking to its tried and true formula. So it's clear that the traditional Metroid formula isn't very attractive in the eyes of general audiences. I'll explain why I think this is, in addition to an additional disadvantage the series has holding it down. Before anything else, I want to address what you're likely thinking if you're a fan of the Metroidvania subgenre. A Hollow Knight sold a shit ton of copies? Yes, I will address this in a bit. But right now, let's rewind back to the beginning. The gaming landscape back in the NES era was a completely different time. It was very much a children's hobby, and if there's one thing we all know about children, it's that their patience and problem-solving abilities are still undeveloped. Mario is lots of people's favorite series for one reason or another, but I believe there's a specific reason why Mario consistently trounced Zelda and Metroid all throughout their shared history. It better adhered to the philosophy that I like to call stimulation without taxation. Get comfy for this. In simplified terms, this philosophy says that the more a game mentally demands of the player, the harder it is to positively resonate and have staying power. To explain this in better detail, let's make a list of all the qualities that define each series. Mario is the least demanding of the three, asking the player to do a single thing, platforming. Zelda asks the player to do three things: fighting, searching, and solving puzzles. And Metroid is the most demanding of them all: fighting, searching, solving puzzles, and platforming. Keep in mind, the vast majority of gamers back during the third and fourth console generations were kids, and non-linearity in games was far rarer than it is today. Linear side-scrolling was the norm back then, largely because those were the types of games that were both easy to make and resonant with the young children playing games back then. And this continued even in succeeding gaming generations. So many of the best-selling games, even up to the present, aren't likely to have more than one or two facets to their formulas. While this isn't a hard and fast rule, as I'll demonstrate in a bit, having fewer facets makes it easier to avoid taxing the player, and stimulation without taxation is the ideal. Let me put it this way: do you think Grand Theft Auto would be the juggernaut that it is if the Metroidvania formula was applied to it? And speaking of open world games, let's run down why Breath of the Wild found such huge success. The total number of facets between Breath of the Wild and previous Zelda games didn't actually change. What Breath of the Wild did was replace its most mentally taxing facet, searching, with a less taxing one, traversing. Shrines in Breath of the Wild still need to be found, but no matter what direction the player goes after stepping off the Great Plateau, they'll come across shrines just by walking. And even the ones that are better hidden aren't hard to find, because the player can progress secure in the knowledge that they need only gain enough stamina to climb to high places, then set markers on every distant shrine they see. And, of course, there are shrine quests for those who want a bit more of a challenge. But the game wouldn't have been as popular if the player didn't have the option to leave any point where they get stuck and go do something else while still making progress. Something that the Metroidvania formula simply doesn't allow. And because it's less accommodating, it makes perfect sense that it's historically been less successful. That's not to say that the Metroidvania formula can't find success, particularly as time goes on. It's fair to say that the reason Metroidvanias never became a real genre until the 2010s is because the gaming public favored simpler, linear games for the longest time. But even as it became a real genre, it's had little to no presence outside of the indie scene, developed by and for people who grew up playing Metroid and Castlevania games. Of course, times can change. JRPGs were an incredibly niche genre in the US in the 80s and early 90s before the gaming public matured enough to see its beauty. People undoubtedly look at the smashing success of Hollow Knight and Silksong as proof that the genre can achieve mainstream success. That's certainly a possibility, but we also need to acknowledge a few additional factors that help those games. The first is that all the Silksong zealotry in the years leading up to its release helped keep the first game in the public spotlight and build interest in it. Like, anyone who knows anything about the games is well aware of how religiously devoted Hollow Knight fans were to it, enough to broadcast the sequel's existence at every opportunity. But just as significant is the simple reality that there are exceptions to every rule. The genre might be able to find success, but at the same time, Hollow Knight and Silksong might represent its apex in popularity. Only time will tell the truth. But let's circle back around to Metroid specifically, and go over that additional factor holding it back that I alluded to earlier. A significant barrier to entry Metroid has going against it was the subject of my second to previous video. I'll briefly summarize it in this video for your sake. Metroid was conceived during a very different time in a world with very different cultural sensibilities. The world of the 80s and early 90s, especially in the United States, valued rough and gritty characters and settings, traditional masculinity essentially. It was also a time when science fiction had much greater pull than it does nowadays. But as the new millennium dawned on the world, and up to the present day, sensibilities began to shift. Nowadays, cuteness, softness, and traditional femininity have far greater pull than they once did, leaving less room for dark and gritty IP like Metroid to find massive success. But 2D Metroid, I feel, could potentially find some measure of success, something I wouldn't say about the Prime series. And this is where I'll relay my personal experience playing the games in preparation for this video. I went through Super Metroid having remembered the general order of progression, so I was able to get through it without really getting lost. The bigger problems came in the form of awkward controls and annoying platforming, things that I have no doubt have been improved both in future titles and other games in the Metroidvania genre. Something that I can partially attest to, but my experience with the original Metroid Prime was... Getting lost wasn't really a problem here either, thanks to the hint system. And while the general difficulty of combat and puzzles were aggravating at times, those are also things that can be improved. But the navigation is the one thing that I'm skeptical could be improved, at least not without compromising what hardcore fans love about the series. And I'm comfortable saying that because, and I'll be diplomatic here, Metroid fans are very picky. I made it about 25% or so through Prime before my frustration got too great and I put the game down. On top of the existing difficulty, trying to use the 3D map was a massive pain. More than once, I got turned around and was backtracking away from my objective, and needing to fiddle with the 3D map every 5 seconds to reorient myself is something I distinctly remember bothering me even back when I first played the game in the 2000s. My immediate thought for how to solve this is a guide arrow of some kind, but I can't imagine this being implemented without fans crying foul. But I genuinely believe that's the biggest factor holding Prime specifically back. The fact that Prime 2's sales dropped so dramatically following the first game shows that that first game failed to get its hooks in all those people, and I'm willing to bet the navigation was the biggest contributing factor. And now I'm gonna go over other reasons I've seen put forth as to why Metroid has always struggled and debunk them. First up is the belief that Metroid fails because it keeps getting released on underperforming hardware. And then people sometimes claim that sales struggle because certain games betray what makes the series so great, angering fans. If you've watched the video up until now, you'll see why the Metroid formula already isn't pulling in huge numbers, but even the ones that dramatically shook up the formula, like Other M, sold in the same ballpark as the more beloved titles. But anyone who's a longtime Fire Emblem fan can attest that sometimes stripping away aspects of a series' core identity doesn't preclude a boost in sales. And in some cases, as I believe with Breath of the Wild, can directly lead to one. And lastly, there's the belief that Nintendo not making previous games in the series readily purchasable leads to a lack of interest in newer titles. Again, I'll refer you to Awakening. But also, despite most games in the Metroid series not being readily available on modern systems at the time of Dread's release, it still managed to become the best-selling game in the series. But also, don't underestimate the power of cultural osmosis. People can find any and all information they want and need in the internet age, so they don't need to play a previous game themselves to get a general sense of if a new one will be to their liking. And now I'm going to wrap this video up with some advice for the fans regarding sales. And remember, this applies to all fans of all series. Obsession and paranoia toward the financial success of Metroid boils down to fear. Fear that the series will eventually be shelved due to lack of profitability, especially as corporations are increasingly pressured to maximize profits in our hyper-capitalist society. But all this mindset achieves is self-harm. Worrying about the fate of a series you love blinds you to the incredible legacy that series has already achieved. Metroid has achieved greater longevity and acclaim than lots of other series, even with how small it is in the grand scheme of things. To use a personal example, I am a huge fan of the little indie horror game Evil Tonight. Think Resident Evil in the art style of Final Fantasy VI. You've probably never heard of this game, and indeed, I would say it's criminally underrated even as an indie game. But as much as I love the game, I'm also not clamoring for a sequel. If the developers decide to make one, I'll buy it day one. But I'm also satisfied with the game being standalone. It's an amazing game that I can go back to whenever I get the urge to relive its magic. The simple, sad reality is that there's only so much success to go around. But Metroid has achieved plenty of success already, and while there's certainly nothing wrong with hoping the series can continue and even reach far greater heights, it's better to be appreciative of the amazing heights the series has already achieved than to obsess over the idea of it climbing ever higher, especially if climbing ever higher would require it to sell out. Thank you for watching. Any and all feedback is appreciated, and if you enjoy reading, feel free to check out my self-published book library on Amazon. All books are available in physical and digital editions, and free to read on Kindle Unlimited. Link is in the description. Alright, best wishes.